It seems like these past few months for me have been a challenge, but actually in reality, if they've been a challenge, they've probably been that way because, of my feelings and frustrations and anger and things, and actually not trusting in the Lord. Even though one sometimes realizes that the Lord is in control and acknowledges that and things, there's always the anger and things that come up in many people's lives. I'd like to share a story today with you about a lady who chose not to be that way at all in her life. And it's just a short few paragraphs here, but she titled it, The Consequences of the Fall. Today in our Sabbath school lesson, we talked about the consequences of the fall, if you will. The fall, I like to title it The Fall, the Plea, the Judgment, and the Covenant, or the Rainbow. Those three things were, tried to point out about God's character and everything. She's talking here about the consequence of the fall, and that being death, one of those things that happened. Satan said it wouldn't, but God said and had told him beforehand that it certainly would. The June before I left home to attend graduate school, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. It was an aggressive strain, but the unusual thing about that was that she did not meet any of the cancer's common risk factors and did not even have a family history. There was no obvious reason for why this happened to her at 56 years of age. Over the summer, I drove her to various medical appointments for checkups and treatment. I made all the grocery runs and pitched in more around the house. At her request, though, I left for school at the end of the summer. It was difficult saying goodbye to her. Even at the time, I was not certain I would really probably ever see her again. After leaving, I kept up with my parents over the phone. I would text Mom throughout the day, sneaking messages in while attending class. And as I was working on my studies on one side of the country, her body was quickly deteriorating on the other side. October, she had already been taken to the emergency room multiple times and had been admitted to the hospital for several days at a time as well. There were evenings where planned phone calls were foregone because my father said they were rushing to the hospital. I would wait anxiously until I heard from him again, giving a sigh of relief when an update was finally sent. As her hospital trips became more frequent, I determined that I needed to fly out to see her. She was in the hospital when I arrived, and she had just decided she wanted to stop all active treatment and instead move into palliative care. I cried with her in her hospital room as we felt the weight of her imminent passing. My brother, his wife, and my grandmother all flew in over the next few days while she was still aware of things. We spent her last day together talking to her and telling her what a difference she had made in so many lives. And then she was gone. After her memorial, I returned to my studies and I tried to continue on with my life. My body was racked with grief and overwhelmed. I struggled for quite some time to find a new norm for life without Mom. It was difficult, but through supportive friends, counseling, and a dependence on God, I began to feel the healing. Since Mom's death, people have asked me if I was ever upset with God. After all, my mother was a beloved woman. She was kind and compassionate and was a light to many. So why should a loving God allow this to happen? Why would he allow me to experience the pain of losing my mother? I must admit, though, that I was actually never upset with God. Yes, there were times I was angry at cancer and angry at the circumstance that my mother, myself, and my family had experienced. I was angry and hurt that this was our story, but I was never angry with God. I was raised to view life through the lens of a great controversy story. I knew from Revelation 12:7 that there was war in heaven. I knew that the plague of sin had to spread across the world to ultimately demonstrate God's fairness and Satan's deceit. With this perspective, my mother's death was a casualty of war. It was not the result of an inactive or uncaring God. It was simply the tragic result of living in this world of sin. Throughout my grieving process, in the wake of her death, I did not see God as cold and uncaring. I did not see him as weak and unable to help. Rather, I experienced a God who grieves with his people. In the New Testament, Jesus is called Emmanuel, meaning God with us. The prophet Isaiah calls Jesus a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. And Peter notes that God is not wishing that any should perish. God himself despises the effects of sin, and he cries with us in the face of death. But we have a loving God who is also grieved by sin and who stands with us through our grief. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed spirit. In suffering, it can be very easy for us to place our focus on ourselves, others, or our circumstances. We might be tempted to blame others for our suffering or to blame ourselves for not doing something differently. If only I had, or if only I hadn't. We can get so caught up in the pain of suffering that we might find ourselves drifting away from God, when in fact he deserves to be right with us, strengthening us, and empathizing with us through our trials. If we would only put our trust in him. That was the experience of the psalmist Asaph. But we can see that he also had many problems too, and he had a trial to be near to God as well. Psalm 73. I'd like to read just a few portions of that. I'm going to read from the Clear Word Bible today, if you will permit me. And I'm going to read verse 1 and then go down a little and read a few other verses and then close with verse 28. God is surely good to be righteous to all those who are pure in heart. And then Asaph replies, he said, as for me, my feet almost slipped. I nearly lost my hold on you, Lord. I was jealous of the arrogant and even the wicked, and of the death that comes to many. And we go on down to verse 27. It says, "Those who go on without you will perish. Those who are unfaithful to you will have to suffer the consequence. But as for me, how wonderful to be close to you and to feel you by my side. I have put my trust in you, and I will tell everyone what you have done for me." That's a very positive way of thinking of the things that cause us grief and put burdens upon our hearts and the challenges that come with all of that. Because pain and suffering are everyday experiences for humanity, and because they are uncomfortable and undesirable, every worldview seeks to explain the existence of suffering, or at least propose a way to inhibit it. Using Scripture as a guide, the explanation behind our misery is clear. The reality of our world is that it is infested with evil as a result of the fall of Lucifer and the fall of Adam and Eve. And furthermore, even though suffering is commonplace in our lives, it makes sense that we disdain it because we ultimately were not created for it. Our Creator has always had desires of good and only good for us. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to changes. Even Jesus said, "If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask them?" There are worldviews that acknowledge that God, and at the same time blame Him for all the evil that is poured out upon the earth. Some might suppose that maybe God is angry with them, and that is why the tragedy has happened. Or they might ask God, "Why have you done this?" Have you ever been there? There's even the phrase, "an act of God." This is used to describe a natural or unforeseeable disaster. God is made out to be the cause of suffering. But when looking through the narrative of the great controversy, we can see that Satan is the arbiter of evil, and God's character of love remains true. Some might suggest that while God does not directly bring evil and punishment upon His people, His inaction to prevent suffering, in fact, demonstrates evil within His own heart. A point to note on this, however, is that God has the larger story in mind, beyond the small pieces we can see. Satan's rebellion was to be a lesson to the universe through all the coming ages, a perpetual testimony to the nature and the terrible results of sin. The working out of Satan's rule, its effect upon both men and angels, would show what must be the fruit of setting aside divine authority. It would testify that with the existence of God's government and His law is bound up the well-being of all the creatures that He's made. Thus, the story of this terrible experience of rebellion was to be a perpetual safeguard to all holy intelligence, to prevent them from being deceived as the nature of transgression, to save them from committing sin and the suffering of its punishment. You know, in our Sabbath school lesson this morning, we were discussing, in bottom line, the character of God. And If you'll notice in reading that sometime in Genesis, the account of the flood and the building of the ark, several things came out that I think are quite important to us. One of those is the fact that the account says that Noah followed God's instructions implicitly, right down to the letter. And that, of course, gave the ark the strength to carry out its purpose, to bring Noah and his family through the flood. But it even more deeply than that, it shows a faith and a trust like Abraham had, like we should have, a faith and a trust in God. There's been other scriptural events. I remember a man with leprosy that was asked to dip in the river Jordan 7 times, and that he would be healed of his leprosy. He thought this was quite funny and unusual. He was a Gentile. He wasn't a Christian, if you will, at that time, but reluctantly he did. He got in the water, and then he wanted out, and he still had the spots of leprosy upon him. And it wasn't until he finally dipped the 7th time. And then I think maybe it was starting to soak in to him. And sometimes we're that way as well. We don't want to follow God's instructions implicitly to the letter, if you will. So I think in dealing with the unfortunate occurrences that happen to us, we do often blame God. We often think that He is truly responsible, and that it's not just part of the overall big picture of showing how terrible sin is. I recall myself doing this one time. I had a dear friend that was a pastor in the old-time Methodist church. I think they were, I can't remember the name of the denomination. His wife worked for me as a registered nurse, and we become friends. About the same time, he had a tragedy in his life that we experienced in our family. Our daughter Diane passed away, and his wife was killed in a car accident just a few days later by one of our co-workers, actually, a young man that worked for me at the nursing home. And he apparently was inebriated with some controlled substance, and he just turned the wheel of his car and drove right in front of him from, going 60, 70 miles an hour down the road, and they were coming, and he just turned in front of them. They had no time to do anything. I told him, he came to me, and we were both grieving, obviously. I was trying to comfort him with shallow words, and he was offering me comfort, probably in a more professional way. But one of my replies to him was, well, God allowed it to happen. He was trying to explain to me that it wasn't God's purpose to destroy and to take the lives of people, that he sorrowed in that happening. And I said, but he allowed it to happen. I was expressing my anger and my frustration and sorrows with that. In her conclusion here to her story, I'd like to share this with you. It says, "It's clear from Scripture that the source of evil originated in Lucifer's heart of pride and resentment. This is ultimately what brought the pain and the calamity and the difficulty into the world. However, it's also clear that God desires our good and wants what's best for us. His greatest evidence for this can be seen when he sent his son Jesus to rescue all humanity. While the second act of the great controversy is dark under the shadow of sin, the third act will be filled with the light of the sun." What a promise and what a blessing that is to us. You know, I think it's so evident right now that this time is coming quite soon. It can't be far away for us. Our challenge at this time, I think, is to present ourselves as characters that represent the character of Jesus in every way that we can. Preaching doesn't seem to be the answer with so many people these days, but I do believe truly yet that as they see that humble character in our lives and that kind of an expression of living, that we can do the good. And also, I think that as we join together with one another and give each other this assurance, we can be among those that stand when, as God said to Noah a week before the flood, he said, "My probation is closed." And he invited them to go into the ark. And there was no one else that would be allowed to. The angel shut the door. The rains came. Many came out at that time and said, "Oh, by the way, yes, I want to go too." And perhaps we'll see some of that, but I think it's going to be more hate and the kind of thing that Noah had to put up with for 120 years of people making fun of him about building a boat, and that there was going to be a destruction of the earth. So I just pray that each one of us can exude that character in our lives, keep that promise dear to our hearts, and look forward to the time when Jesus does come. Thank you. Okay.